Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. I am Jean-Luc. I'm here as the chairman of the Aspen Institute in France, but also as a CEO and investor, as a chairman of my own investment company, Atlantis, working with large private equity firms. And obviously, the topic that we are going to discuss during this panel is a new model of capitalism needed. Rings a bell for me in my activities and with the role for Aspen. But we mostly are very honored and happy to have this discussion with Salim Ismail. First of all, because he is a serial entrepreneur and he has created a series of companies, particularly in the technology sector, but also because he's been appointed as the founding executive director of Singularity University. And obviously, for those who have not been to Singularity, there is always a before and an after. I did this experience several times, and when you try to think about the world and think about innovation and think about new models, it's clearly there that you can have a pure brainstorming, if not a brainwashing, in order to think differently in the future. And obviously, when we go through the kind of crisis we're going through with the COVID, but it's been the case 10 years ago with the financial crisis, it's always the opportunity for all of us, and that's what we're doing today, to think about the new models, to think about the efficiency of the existing models, to see if we should change something in the economic, political, social, technological model. And at the end of the day, what was bad, what was good, and how can we improve our own way of managing the situations. And for those who have this role, this world. And it's, by the way, what the managing director of the IMF, Georgieva, said recently: the COVID crisis is a chance to fix capitalism. So, Salim, this being said, do you think that's the case, and how do you see the current situation and all the changes and all the challenges that we're facing now?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And I think this is a fundamentally important discussion, maybe the most important discussion we could be having today in the world. I think I'll use the analogy that Lawrence Bloom, he was, I think, the first chairman of the World Economic Forum, mentioned. He said that capitalism is like a booster rocket. It lifted humanity out of poverty and feudal systems and religious systems, and lifted us out of that. And it took us out of kind of that low Earth orbit. But to really take us to the next level, we need to get rid of that booster rocket and go to a much lighter, more elegant spacecraft. And what does that look like? And the danger is, if you don't let go of that booster rocket, you get pulled back down, right? And I think we're at a very important inflection point where it's been incredibly useful and powerful. But now, what do we do next? And maybe the fundamental driver is that we're moving the world in many, many domains from scarcity to abundance. Information used to be scarce and now it's abundant. Music used to be scarce and now it's abundant. Energy used to be scarce and we're moving towards abundance. And the model looks very different in that world. And so we think there's a totally new form of capitalism that's needed.
And according to you, if we look first back, what has been, first of all, by most of the governments recently and over the past months, done properly, and where do you see the major issues?
So I think of Corona as a singularity, right? The world, every model by which we ran the world now doesn't work anymore. We need completely new models. And so this is its own inflection point. And I think there's a few observations I've made about most of this year, which is the governments that understood exponentials well dealt with it very properly, because they could see what happens when one person gives it to two people, gives it to 4, 8, and it goes very quickly. So slam down on it very hard. And the governments that dealt with it badly and didn't understand this, cough, cough, the US, Brazil, etc., did very poorly. The other interesting thing is the smaller countries and smaller regions and smaller city states, Taiwan, Singapore, um, um, uh, and others dealt with it very well, and the big countries had a very difficult time. And so I think this gives some interesting indicators about the future. Like in the past, being a big country was very useful. Lots of natural resources, critical mass in multiple industries, but it's just too hard in a world that's moving quickly to be a big country. Much more useful today, I think, to be smaller. And so there's some heuristics and kind of dynamics going on. And I think the big dynamic and shift that's happening in the world, and you can see that in Brexit and with Trump, is not really left versus right. It's really city versus rural, urban versus rural. And there's a huge tension point in the world around that dynamic.
Well, I can only confirm, as you may know, I'm a Monegasque. I've been the chief of staff of His Serene Highness Prince Albert. We're a very, very small country, even a village, and we dealt with this rather easily because the decisions taken has been immediately put in place. But obviously, we only can think about, and especially with the topic that you were addressing today about the large countries and the consequences of this crisis also on the economy and on this topic for the panel, the capitalism. So how do you think the private sector and the public sector are interacting to manage this kind of crisis and the consequences on the populations, and obviously including all business areas and directly all the individuals?
Yeah, so I think there's two major dynamics happening between public and private sector. I'll quote Jeremy Rifkin here. He wrote this book, Zero Marginal Cost, a few years ago, and he argues that capitalism has been so successful in making goods and services more efficient and more effective that it's now eating itself, and the cost of lots of goods and services are actually going to zero. Um, uh, many services and apps on my smartphone are essentially free, and so therefore the marginal cost is disappearing. And we actually noticed, when you're running a business, you worry about demand and supply. And the internet allowed us to drop the cost of demand exponentially, online marketing and referral marketing. And for the first time in business history, you could acquire customers at no cost. And now a whole new breed of what we call exponential organizations are learning how to supply at zero cost. Right? You think about Uber, the cost of adding a new driver or is very low. For Airbnb, the cost of adding a new hotel room is very cheap. They just had a new user. And therefore, these companies are totally changing the game with low marginal cost of supply and demand. And we've never seen this before. And so I think the combination makes capitalism so hyper efficient, it literally eats itself. Right? I think that's one major dynamic that's going on. I think the second major dynamic is that capitalism, because it's driven by the sheer will for power and money and the need for more of it, has, in the US certainly, we have what's called regulatory capture, and capitalism has essentially eaten the public sector. And in deregulation, for example, as example, I'll give you my favorite statistic about this. Over the last 3-4 years in the US, 40% of corporate profits have gone to the financial services sector. Okay, 40% of US corporate profits going to the financial sector, which is supposed to be a lubricant and an enabler of industries, but basically it's eating those industries. And so I think what's happened is capitalism has become too big, too powerful, and too extractionary, and now needs to be reined in. And we can't do it ourselves, so Mother Nature is essentially sending us a friend in the form of COVID to do it.
Yeah, as you speak about that, during the past months, what we have observed in Europe and in France in particular is that most of the actors, individuals and companies, have reached out to the governments to get some help.
Yes.
In France, for instance, they have allocated more than 100 billion euros of loans from the banks guaranteed by the state, which means every time there is a major issue, people are immediately reaching out to the public sector to get some help. Do you think is the right way of dealing with this, or can we find precisely a new capitalism where there would be a different way of approaching the research for solutions in this kind of crisis?
Yeah, you have this whole movement in conscious capitalism, where people are saying, let's have capitalism with a purpose and with a broader picture as to the overall costs of the system, right? Uber, for example, is an extractionary model. It's not taking into account the social contract that's needed. How do you deal with unemployment, pension plans, et cetera, et cetera? And it's layered on top of that. And so the challenge, I think, in many industries, if you took the full cost of operating, like environmental costs, the industry wouldn't be profitable. And so they operate by kind of extracting from the rest of society. When you have a problem, the costs get socialized. I think the big mistake with the 2008 crisis was they said the banks are too big to fail. They should have let the banks fail. The idea about too big to fail, I think, is a huge issue. If you don't allow failure, then you're not balancing risk and reward, and therefore somebody's going to pay the price. And right now, it's the common man, and it's the environment that's suffering badly. So that has to transform. I'm very happy to see over the last few years the rise of purpose-driven capitalism. When we talk about new organizations, I talk about them having what I call a massive transformative purpose, or an MTP. And Larry Fink from BlackRock is saying we'll only invest in purpose-driven organizations. I think that's all very nice, but I think it's lipstick on a pig. I think if the thing was losing money, but it was good for the environment, nobody's investing in it. And there's a huge challenge right now. And I think I'll boil it down to the fundamental observation from a fellow called Jeff Booth, who wrote a book called The Price of Tomorrow, who analyzed the macroeconomic situation and found that today we're actually growing the world with debt. He noticed that for every increase in GDP globally, we're actually creating $4 in global debt. And so this is not a good equation, right? And so at some point that's going to collapse. We saw a little bit of it in the 2008 crisis. He thinks there are two forcing functions that would collapse that bubble. One is deflationary technology, and the other is cryptocurrencies. I would argue Corona is a third model which will collapse the global economy, because as say a third of small businesses fail, that cascades to commercial lenders, commercial real estates, back to the financial sector very quickly, and the whole thing starts to implode. And I think that's the danger.
And obviously, we're all facing this as an investor, and especially what we have in private equity. We try to implement new rules, and especially this purpose for a company and as an investor. There is, as you mentioned, a limit. We would be naive thinking that at some point, as you said, if you have an investment which is good for environment or other issues, we're going to accept reducing returns, even if we all know that we have to do part of this effort. And that's also the meaning of the question that we have in this discussion. Is it needed? Definitely yes, because we observe that the wealth is not allocated with a well-balanced system. But the question is how? How can we do? So obviously it starts from saying the companies, the investors have to have a purpose, have to stick to some of rules. Do you think we're going to be able to go quickly to the next steps, which will be from words to acts?
No. And the reason I'm not optimistic around that is that we've never been able to do it in the past, right? Well, we found that no system is really able to transform itself. You need a kind of a creative destruction forcing function around the model. And so I think the system needs to be replaced. So one of the observations we made building Singularity and also advising companies and building organizations today is you can never do disruptive innovation in the core organization. You have to do it at the edge and let that become the new gravity center. So, for example, capitalism can't fix itself. You need to create new models and let the world move to that. And I'll tell you what that I think that forcing function is. Again, let me just go back to the fact that capitalism and investment vehicles and the way we've done things in the past have been unbelievably successful at moving us out of poverty, changing our power systems from religious structures to money-driven structures. And a good idea will now yield the best outcome. And that's a good, metaphysically great place to be. But we're shifting, and today, the main mode of discourse in the world is money, right? Profits, capitalism, revenues, GDP, and that's the main conversation, business, commerce, etc. We're shifting that mode of discourse from money to information today. Right? A startup is more interested in collecting data about its users and monetizing it later, like Facebook did, than trying to extract money up front. And so today they're fungible. Information is power, as we know. And so little by little, though, over time, as technology drops the cost of traditional sectors like education or healthcare or energy, more and more information becomes a harder bit, and we need less money. And so we're moving to a new modality where you can only need money in investment models in certain sectors and not in other sectors. And then let's see how we work there. So I think they're in that transition point today.
Yes, which is also, and you probably read the book, Reinventing Capitalism, and from money to data. And
Yeah.
clearly we can see that this has become part of the game and a major game changer. And as we talk about this, and as singularity, and in your own background, you have been dealing a lot about technology and what do you think about the role that technologies can play in bringing a new model for capitalism? And do you think that technology is increasing or reducing, at the end of the day, inequalities?
I think I tend to be an optimist around technology, and the reason is that it's always been a major driver of progress in the world. It may actually be the only major driver of progress that we've ever seen. Better tools, better techniques, etc., to do something always yields better value and better outcomes, right? We're feeding the world today because of better technology. We're able to get video. I can video anywhere with my son. I'll give a small example. If you have a smartphone, people say, "My God, that's I'm absorbed with the screen, and kids are addicted to it." I would argue that smartphone makes me more human. My memory is now in the smartphone, so I can use those neurons for other functions like creativity and humor and a deep intellectual discussion. I can video with my son anywhere in the world, so my sphere of influence and understanding has grown very, very dramatically, and I can see anything that's happening anywhere in the world. So my opportunity to project empathy has grown very dramatically. I would argue that technology makes me more human, not less, right? The fact that we have better medical techniques makes me operate more at Maslow's hierarchy, at the top of that self-actualization aspect. I can spend more time in that domain than any time in the previous human history, where most of the time we were spending 18 hours a day in the fields trying to put 3 meals on the table. And so I'm a very fervent technology optimist for that reason. And today we have a dozen technologies all accelerating, so that gets us very excited, right? Neuroscience. Like, for example, I've got a device in the next room that will literally eradicate breast cancer. And so just that will alleviate enormous suffering around the world, like we've had with vaccines and other things. So if you look at that model, then things are very exciting for the future. And how quickly can we move there? And capitalism, as I said, has been very good at moving us very quickly along the way. And now I think we need other forms alongside capitalism to get us the last way.
Yes. And how would you even more precisely determine these new forms?
That is a good question. I dislike the fourth industrial revolution framing of it because I don't think it's the fourth, and I don't think it's industrial. Um, I do like the word abundance, and we coined that term at Singularity University. Peter's written a book on that, and I think that's where we're ending. I think as a society we have two paths today. We have a Mad Max future or a Star Trek future, right? And we're kind of heading down the Mad Max path right now. That's the scarcity-driven tribal thinking that is kind of fighting over things. As we actually have the opportunity to move to more of a Star Trek model where we have abundant healthcare, education, clean water, energy, and we can live our lives dealing with how we want to live them and self-actualize at a much larger percentage of the time. And I think that's where we'll get to. And I think what Corona does, it gives us the opportunity to stop and change the direction from A to B.
If we go back to education, uh,
Yeah.
and for me, having been involved for almost 30 years in our business school organization, HEC, as a former and now honorary chairman of the alumni, the foundation, and all the new developments at the board level. Uh, one of the one of the possibilities to bring everybody to a new form of capitalism is also to invest a lot of money on education and bringing into the system more people knowledgeable and prepared in order to live in this world. Have you been working on this? And I think you did at Singularity and on your own. And how do you see the possibility for the governments to take a major decision about a huge possible education plan?
Oh boy, I think we have very few minutes left. So if you get me started on education, we'll be here for a long time. I'm super excited about the future of education. I'm completely not excited about the models that we're using now. So today we do education in a push format. You get kids into a classroom, you try and cram algebra into them, right? Mostly they're thinking about lunch, and it doesn't cater for some kids being very gifted and others not. We put everybody on the same path, etc. The other big challenge I see, and we found this at Singularity, is that the world is moving so quickly that the traditional model doesn't work anymore. If you spend almost any MBA program in the world teaches you how to build a 20th century company, not an Uber, right? Or take if you're doing a master's degree in robotics or biotech or neuroscience, today, literally by the time you finished your master's degree, you're out of date because the field is moving faster than our ability to change it. So I think there's radical rethinking needed for education. Note that today you pull it down as you need it for the work or project that you're taking on. And so I think that's how we'll think about education. And the idea that we learn a deep skill for the first 20, 23 years of our lives, then we're a productive member of society, and then we retire is essentially gone, right? The half-life of a skill used to be about 30 years, and now it's about 5 years. And so we have to reinvent ourselves on a nonstop basis to add value properly in the world. So I think this radically requires a rethinking in education. And frankly, one of the things we had to do with students at Singularity was have them unlearn uh, old structures and open up their brains so they could take on new ideas and new models. And so the concept of unlearning is a huge area that we need to look at.
And so through unlearning and through this approach, inventing new models on a permanent basis and not
Yeah,
build on stones from the past, let's say.
there's that. Let me make it a little more tangible. I think the engineering degree of the future won't be that, oh, hey, I studied engineering for 4 years. You'll go out and build things. And after 4 years, we'll say, what did you build? Because we learn by doing better than anything. There's no better way of learning business than to going out and building a business. Um, an MBA school is like standing outside a race car and saying, here's how it works. You have to get in the car to learn how to drive, right? And I think that's what we'll start to do more and more of.
One of the issues the governments have with this is how can we finance this transition? How can we finance the access of a larger number of people to studies, not only at very high level, but at useful level? How do you see this financing? Obviously, there are completely different models between the various geographic areas.
Honestly, I think it goes to free. I think it should be free. I think it's not expensive today. If you record a great lecture on how to think about investing, 1 billion people can watch that lecture for free, right? This was just not possible in the past, where we developed our educational models where one person could address 30 people in a small room, and that's the only reach you could have. Now we have 1 billion people, the whole world can listen to one lecture. You take out all the transmission costs, and therefore I think we need to rethink education in the face of that. And in fact, that's one of the things that we're doing with our ecosystem, is rethinking our institutions like education, journalism, governance models, monetary systems, from a grassroots perspective, to be more fit for the world that's coming. Because the people in education are the worst people to think about what's coming next. About 5 years ago, Peter invited me to a board offsite of the Singularity University board. And I asked the question, if we had to rebuild it today, it's 10 years old, we would do it very differently. In 2008, when we created it, there was no Facebook, there was no social media, there was no e-learning platforms. So the board said, okay, go think about that. How would you rebuild it today? And I tried 4 separate times to do that exercise, and I couldn't, because I was so instrumental in the model that became successful. My mind kept going back to the old model, right? And so we have a very difficult time in conceiving new ideas from the old. We have to really have new, different people invent the future. And I think where I'm inspired today is by the youth of today, the Greta Thunbergs of the world, that are just going, the hell with the old, right? We should be rethinking things completely, and we need to, in the face of environmental catastrophe and extractionary capitalism and income inequality and so on.
Which means, if I had to summarize, as I see we still have 2 minutes, if I had to summarize our discussion, we clearly share the view that there is a need for a new capitalism, that we have to reinvent, rethink, and especially through different methods. Technology is a key factor for this. Education is another key factor for this. And obviously finding the money and having the money at our disposal is one. How do you think this is possible with a world that is more divided than ever, with a major lack of leadership, and some countries which used to be the leaders even saying, I don't have to play a role in the world globally, I'm just taking care of my own internal issues? How do you see this whole plan, which I share, to bring us to a new form of capitalism and improve our societies, when there is so little good leadership in the world?
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue. The leadership in the world today should basically be taken out and put to pasture. And not their fault. They were trained in an environment where the world was stable and linear and incremental, and you didn't have to do that much. Today, we have to navigate through multiple black swan events at the same time, and we're not trained. Our leadership is not trained for this. So we need a totally new form of leadership, but I think we need new structural forms. I'll give you one example. I'm very, very excited by the results we're seeing from universal basic incomes, and what happens when you implement that. Entrepreneurship explodes, etc. I think if we did nothing but just implement that, leveraging on the fact that the technology is delivering us a lot of so much productivity, then we can basically aim towards that point and dematerialize our old models very quickly, and it'll happen naturally. I think either we have to do it or nature will do it for us, is where we are right now.
Well, Salim, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have this discussion with you. I'll definitely come back to Singularity as soon as we can travel from Europe overseas. And with this, I think our friends in Bucharest will take the lead now and move to the next discussion. Thank you, everybody, for attending this discussion.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.